Well, where do we get to with this rather long recording, the one just before this part? In particular, I'm thinking in relation to the Jesus story. There are problems that may not have been inherent in the first write of the story, or earlier rites. It's not clear that crucifixion was at the end of each of the Gospels, that it may have been added to one or two of the Gospels to draw them into conformity with each other. And in particular, the crucifixion and the harassment of Jesus is not something that appeals to those who don't fancy being crucified or being harassed. So one wonders if this really is the way. Yes, it would be nice to have these miraculous powers. Don't think it would be nice to not be married. To only live to the age of 30, whatever, 30, and not to be an acceptable part of your society, part the hierarchy, part the elite. Would it be attractive to be homeless? A wandering outcast of his society? It doesn't immediately have the ingredients of attractiveness, you see. In other words, you too can have this life if you follow these principles. Ooh, avoid that like the plague. Then, I'm not used to, for instance, in a secular world, I'm not used to relating to persons that are not in physical form. Spiritual beings, gods, and God in particular. It's not your familiarity, your upbringing. And you may see homelessness as not the ideal, and a short life not the ideal. And then what's being prescribed are actions that don't bring comfort and pleasure, which is what you seek. So you start to dismiss the story as definitely not the way to go. Religious nutters, that's not rational from the point of view of particular life experience that you may have had to date. Now this contrasts with a life experience where you've not found the things of the world satisfactory at all. And in fact, if anything, you despair at the badness of such experience, and you're longing for something else. And if in the story you conceive of the hero as having something you want, a meaning to life, and a devotion that brings, joy and meaning, purpose that you find attractive, then of course you have ears to hear. In other words, our concern is not so much with what is true, but pragmatically What's likely to give me what I value? Why I have these values seems to depend on my background, family, experience to date, and parenthood and so on. In other words, we're not looking for understanding of how the universe works, which is what science devotes itself to. We're looking for that which meets our values, that which reliably meets our values. And that is found by experience of the advice we're receiving, the experience that we've had of such already, whether we accept or reject the advice. And if we accept the advice, then our practice of such, confirming or contradicting what we hoped for and expected. And we live accordingly and seek accordingly, according to what our values are at any given time. This then starts to make sense of, know thyself, know thy values, and having discerned what your values are, pursuing such most earnestly. How do you pursue such most earnestly? Well, religion presents the thesis that the personification of what you value may be the most effective way of fashioning your future and devoting yourself to this personification. In other words, your God is of value if your God embodies what you already value. If he does and you devote yourself to that, you will act accordingly and find out if your values are as attractive to you as you thought. If they are, you'll continue. If they're not, you'll modify accordingly. And so you ideally hope to progress to values that are more and more acceptable to you as time goes on, reliably so. Through time, you adjust to such set and therefore reap increasingly by investing in such values more and more success, more and more of what you appreciate, what you value. This, as I see it, seems to be the likely course of your journey through life, which seems to present as following increasingly your understanding of a particular belief system that you find acceptable to you ongoingly as you practice it. But quite simply, someone else's God will not do for the most efficiently way of finding this out. If I practice the values that someone else has, in other words, worship another God, perhaps by imposition, I may continually find this very unsatisfactory. And so we get, members who are constantly gossiping and criticizing and generally causing havoc in the organization because at heart they really have a different value system. And the one they're being pressed to follow is not therefore satisfying them. And they become a thorn in the flesh to the organisation. They may in consequence get excommunicated from it, or they may stay in it and appear to be destructive from the establishment of the organisation's point of view. Well, this is in some sense my reasoning here, and I mean nothing new, not really. I mean, in a sense, anyone could come up with this, can't they? And I suppose I'm saying this weighs against the thesis that I can go out on the street, declare the good news, and evangelize, and the world will follow. It may be that I have quite a peculiar background compared to what the world's valuing, and therefore it will simply be ignored. And, as the Jesus story says, there'll be some that have ears to hear, and they're the ones he focuses on in John 17. Now, you may have a much wider concern for people you know and come into contact with, and indeed for life, any form of life. And so you're wondering how to meet these values that you have as opposed to that narrowly presented by, say, the Jesus story or the Buddhist story. Hindu or whatever, Hebrew and so on, or modern world secularism, which may favour the successful of the particular society you're in. Well, almost by definition, you're going to follow the path of what you see as the greatest happiness that's available to you, and that may be severely blocked by the culture or regime that you've come under in your society or in the organisation in which you're employed and dependent upon for your daily survival needs and so on. A religious solution has often been, separate yourself from the world into some sort of organisation, a fellowship that can survive despite not being very consistent with the general culture of the world you're in, the country you're in, or, the imposition of the empire that you've been coerced into. So the separateness, the individuality in that sense, may start to be acceptable to you in that it meets your values that you have at present, which may well be a fierce discontent with the existing situation. So simplistically, you might hate the fact that you're suddenly bereaved and at a loss, and you seek some sort of company and support that will help address this situation, compensate if you like, and you have ears to hear those that are offering fellowship. The typical way of evangelizing by more ordinary church members, not those that are shouting on the street, but the ordinary churchgoer is to love bomb you when you come into their sphere of influence, so that you think, oh, what a lovely, friendly fellowship this is. I'd like to be part of it. In other words, it appeals to your values at present and your needs, and you're drawn in. As you're drawn in, though, you find there are probably many things about the place that are not conforming to your present beliefs and values. And then you're sort of deciding, do you nonetheless override those values, or do you reject this new order? But the cost would be the loss of friendship and fellowship and being part of and support that you need against your world situation generally, of, say, bereavement and or fear of illness that's going to, terminal illness that you've got. So there are circumstances in which you're going to have ears to hear what's being proclaimed, not because of its inherent truth, but because of, in very practical terms, it meets your needs or not as you perceive it. And your needs are according to your values that are surfacing at present. So I'm come that you might have life and have it more abundantly is a sort of general advertising slogan in a way that surely affects most people and will at least tune in and think, well, is this what I value? Does he mean what I mean? Is this a feasible? And of course you may be so shocked by the crucifixion and so on that you come to the very definite conclusion, no, this isn't. I prefer wine, women and song. Despite the fact that such is not bringing much satisfaction at the minute, perhaps. It did originally, but it seems to have worn a bit thin. It's this constant sort of potential that life, self-motivated, filtered the concept of the narrow self, is in. And you may find that this ongoing chaos and havoc and indeterminacy, you seek something that's going to be much more reliable, and you reach out to what may be possibilities and may listen to, if you like, the evangelist, the person you're talking to who's saying you need to do so and so, you should, sort your life out in this way. And that is potentially good. But of course there's great uncertainty everywhere, so it's also a great risk. And that's the situation we seem to be in much of the time. Can be. Some don't seem to be. They're brought up, Presbyterian, and they die Presbyterian. But you look at their life and think, I don't think I would have found that terribly satisfying, and I'm not clear they did. Yes, they were married for 54 years, but it's not quite what I understand by marriage and the meaningful relationship that I would be looking for. It might have been quite a formal, distant relationship. Yes, it survived half a century, but excluded the living that perhaps you want and would enjoy, or think you would enjoy. So there's all these things going on in your evaluation and determining which way you go. Alright, that's enough of this, I think. Thank you, heaven.